I want to turn now to the life and work of Florence Wald, who is often referred to as the mother of palliative care in the United States, and she's recognized as the single most important person in bringing that idea to the United States. And with Florence Wald, because she's coming out of a nurse educator background, her attitudes and the research she does is a little bit different, and her approach is a bit different for a variety of reasons. And so again, we really see how the personality of the pioneer influences how it all rolls out over time. Although, of course, she was deeply influenced by Cicely Saunders, as we're going to see. When looking at the early life of Florence Wald, I'm taking from a number of sources. One, Prelude to Hospice by Emily K. Abel. So she says that she was born in 1917. Her father was a banker, her mother a secretary, and that although they never went to college, they were rigorously self-educated and they were very liberal in their thinking. So coming from a kind of politically progressive background. And according to this bio, they were socialists, so that idea of believing in social justice and equity. And so according to her own description, they were not particularly religious. A lot of socialists at this time wouldn't have been, but I think we have to be careful with that, because clearly she's coming from a Christian Jewish background, and we know from earlier lectures that Jewish tradition of taking care of the weak and those in need comes very much from that tradition. And so so she said her father was quite critical of Christianity, even though he came from that background. So she eventually married a Jewish person, and according to her daughter Sherry Vogler, Wald's husband was born into an Orthodox Jewish family, so that when they married, they agreed to bring their children up Jewish. They belonged to a conservative synagogue and celebrated the High Holy Days and Passover. And this has been my experience with a lot of Jewish people. They're basically what's called secular Jews. So they're not necessarily identifying as completely observant, but they still practice the high holidays. So kind of culturally Jewish. So she graduated, sorry, I just want to back this up a bit. We also know that as a child, she was quite ill and was hospitalized for a period of time. So again, we have that example of somebody who hasn't had it easy in their early life, who's experienced sickness. And so according to her biography, this leads her into nursing, her own struggles with her health and recovery. So she graduated from Mount Holyoke in 1938 and then went to the Yale School of Nursing in 1941. Her first job was at Henry Street Nurses Settlement, established by Lillian Wald in New York's Lower East Side. They weren't related, apparently, but the Lower East Side being, again, at that time anyway, an impoverished area. So we can see she's interested in this kind of work. And then after the war, she was on the nursing staff at New York's Babies Hospital. So during this time too, she also becomes interested in psychiatry, and this is very different than Cicely Saunders, and it does influence her attitudes around nursing. So including kind of psychotherapeutic ideas within nursing is something that she's very interested in. And at this time, the Freudian system was very popular. So so this influences how she understands how to care for patients. And then in 1956, Wald joined the faculty of Rutgers University School of Nursing, and began. She was also a researcher, and so she's interested in things like personal relationships, anxiety, grief, anger, and so on. So working with patients' emotions. And eventually, in 1958, she became Dean of Nursing at Yale. And so this is important for a number of reasons. So we can see in this case, in the American case, that the movement is coming out of an academic setting to some extent, and rather than a hospital religious setting, as we saw in the UK. And so research is very important to Wald right from the beginning. And she's also very concerned because this is the period in which nursing schools were beginning to attach themselves to universities. So the idea of how to do that while maintaining the focus on practice and proper practice, also the role of nurse education. So that's very important to her. In 1963, she meets Dame Cicely Saunders, and so she wasn't a dame at that point. She meets Cicely Saunders, and so she, in any interview, she recognizes the influence of Saunders on her work. So there's an interesting quotation from one of the interviews with Florence Wald. I've had to cobble this together because there's no definitive biography on Wald. So in one of the interviews, so Wald's husband also gets involved, and he gets involved with the planning of the hospice. And actually the papers at Yale are under both of their names. So apparently Saunders said to them, "Get on with it." So I think that says a lot about the movement and Saunders, that it's like, stop, okay, the research is all good and the thinking, but you need to get the shovels in the ground and get it built and get it going. So certainly Saunders was kind of mentor for Wald, but Wald goes her own way, definitely. And so also very important to note that the United States in the 1960s is very different than England in the 1960s. We really see this cultural foment. The Vietnam War is going on, the civil rights movement is happening, the women's rights movement is happening, gay rights movement eventually is happening, and all of these things are of interest to her. She's very, as I said, interested in social justice. So this is all influencing her at the same time. And so she was particularly taken with Saunders' idea that when looking at end of life, it isn't just the physical. So that idea of all those dimensions, the social, the spiritual, the economic, and this very much fit in with her kind of political views as well, that idea that there shouldn't be so much income inequality, etc. So we also see she's interested in the idea of, this isn't said as explicitly, but if you read a number of sources, that traditional hierarchy of nurse and doctor. And so there's a case actually in Prelude to Hospice where she gets into conflict with one of the doctors because he thinks she's overstepping. And so this was an ongoing thing, and I'm sure this is still going on, how that plays out. If you say it's a team, but what does that really mean? Who's got the final say, kind of thing. And so she's definitely, obviously, as a nurse, very concerned with this. And in the case of hospice, the nurses are the ones that are doing the vast majority of the care. So it makes sense that she would want to put them at the center. And another important aspect that sometimes gets forgotten, and this was true in the Western world in general, there was a lot of controversy about whether you would tell somebody they were terminal. And it was very typical in those days to not tell the person. And this is something that Saunders was very clear about, that she believed that people had the right to know, because then they can make plans and they can, reflect and do what they need to do. Also, Saunders was very clear that people generally have a sense of what's going on in their own body. So it actually can be very disturbing to feel that you're dying and being told that maybe you're not. Now, obviously, this was never meant in a malevolent way. It was the idea that nobody knows when somebody's going to die, and maybe you don't have the right to say that. But we definitely see a sea change, and I certainly, as far as I know, in the current period, you would always give the person an idea that this might be the end of their life. And so this becomes another important part of hospice and palliative care, and a number of you mentioned this in your papers, the idea that in the beginning, part of the pushback against hospice was this idea of giving up, that you're giving up on the person. And so there had to be a kind of a complete change in how you conceptualize it, that once you know somebody's approaching end of life, that you shift the way that you're looking at it. And so Wald was very aware of this, obviously having practiced as a nurse. And so they begin working on the development of the Connecticut hospice, and Wald actually does a 2-year study between 1969 and 1971, and this study becomes kind of the foundation of how she goes about fundraising, showing that there's a need for this. And so she's looking at a variety of models, and she, of course, looks at St. Christopher's House as her primary inspiration when she goes about developing Connecticut Hospice. As was the case with Cicely Saunders, Florence Wald then becomes extremely active in sort of becoming a driver of the whole movement in the United States. And so that first hospice becomes, again, very important. And once it's built, many get built. And so there's a lot of challenges around that in the beginning. And for many of the same reasons, that kind of death denial culture, focus on cure, and so on. And so she's having to work, she and her husband are having to work very hard to break through that. However, at the same time, there was starting to be a changing landscape and talk of death and dying. So some of you will know the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, very, very famous book that she writes on death and dying and the sort of the stages of grief and so on. And so we're starting to see that the larger landscape is also changing and making it a little bit easier. And so in Abel's book, she talks about the studies that Wald does, and so takes up a number of them. And so again, I really don't want to whitewash this. And so we saw in the case of Saunders, there's some cases with patients where probably now that it would be considered unethical behavior. And so we see also with Wald, there are some cases where she seems to be getting too involved with the family. And I suspect this is a very hard line to know when to cross and when not to cross. And so I think we see with hospice care, especially in the beginning, the idea of learning as we go. And so some mistakes were probably made. She was also taking on a kind of social work function. There was a case with a woman who had young daughters and kind of trying to make sure that those girls were taken care of after the mother passed away and these kind of things. So you can't, I mean, there's no blame being laid here, but Abel's pretty clear there were some controversies. And I do wonder if it is part of that Nightingale effect, that idea of when you're taking care of somebody, of the other things that can, the projections that can start to happen. And so she's eventually obviously successful. And so the first American hospice was founded in 1975 in New Haven. So that's where Yale University is. So again, that very close, rather than with a hospital, with the university, there's a very close connection and networks. And so I'm just going to read from the conclusion in Abel's book. So when Hospice Inc., soon renamed the Connecticut Hospice, opened in New Haven in 1975, Florence Wald was appointed director. Soon, however, the board of directors began to receive complaints from staff members that she tried to insert herself into every aspect of their work, and after a year she was asked to resign. Nevertheless, she remained actively involved in the hospice movement, traveling frequently to promote the establishment of programs throughout the country. So this also was a charge that was leveled against Cicely Saunders, and people often are kind of being careful when they're talking about it, but this is very typical. When somebody found something, it's their baby, and it's very hard for them to let go of it and let the professionals take over. I just think that's human nature, and so this was, and she's obviously a very powerful personality. There was also a case I wanted to mention where she was dealing with a patient and trying to get them to talk about their feelings. So coming out of that kind of psychotherapy model, and the daughter of the woman who was ill said, "We're Catholics, we're good, you know, we have a whole philosophy of death, so we don't need to, my mother doesn't need to talk about it." So it's interesting to see how this is a very different approach, and that I do think the idea of making room for a more religious approach was not as comfortable for Florence Wald. And I find this very American, actually, this idea that if we all talk about our feelings, somehow this is going to help things. And also coming out of that Kubler-Ross, there's been, obviously, I think it's an incredible book, but that idea that there's these neat stages of grieving and you have to come to acceptance is too uniform. And I think it doesn't allow for the fact that everybody has a different experience based on their personality, temperament, cultural background, religion, family situation. So I do think, as far as I know, the whole psychotherapy model was not taken up within hospice. So we see again that she remains very, very active, and when she passed away, there was an outpouring of praise for her. And so, as I said, she's recognized as the most important founder of the whole movement in the United States. And in her later life, in the 1990s, she joined the board at the National Prison Hospice Association, which trains inmates to serve as hospice volunteers within state correctional facilities. So she helped to explain the hospice model within a prison setting. And so I think this part of her career, firstly, we can see that hospice and palliative care is moving further and further out. And I know there are also palliative care that goes out to homeless populations. So we're starting to see it moving beyond its origins, and it's changing and it's adapting to the societies in which it's in. And also the fact that with Florence Wald, that ongoing concern with people that have been forgotten, people who feel marginalized for various reasons, and her belief, you can see very clearly her belief in the importance of all people, regardless of their circumstance.